Okay, let's get started. So, welcome everybody to HotPETs 2022. I'm very happy to be able to bring you today's HotPETs, at least with a bunch of you live here together in the same room. So just like pets, this has been an interesting schedule to put together with remote attendees in both North America and Europe. The challenge was even more difficult for us because unlike pets, we really want HotPETs to be a very interactive event. And that is difficult when half of your attendees are asleep at any given time. I don't know why my share screen just stopped. Let me reshare. Okay, I don't know what to say. So, yes, this is intended to be very much an interactive sort of discussion-based thing. Rebecca and I spent a lot of actual time this year trying to brainstorm ways to bring HotPETs back to being a highly discussion-centric interactive workshop rather than a continuation of the technical program of PETs. So we have 4 really amazing invited speakers as well as 5 contributed presentations. We had a handful of very, very good technical type submissions that we decided not to accept, not on merit, but because we really wanted to facilitate things that would be sort of discussion oriented. So please take that to heart. We've asked the speakers who have 30 minutes to spend 10 to 15 of those minutes actually talking, with the goal of getting you guys talking for the remaining 15 to 20 minutes. And it will be very awkward if you do not spend that 15 to 20 minutes talking. With that said, do not behave like these kangaroos. Let's keep things civil in our discussions. So here's a brief overview of the program. We have sort of the sane for North Americans time in the first session, beginning with our first keynote and then 2 contributed talks and then an invited talk by, so the keynote will start right away by Elissa Redmiles. The invited talk is by Susan McGregor. And then a fairly large gap in the middle, just like with pets, followed by a session that is at a sane time for people joining us from Europe. And there again, we have a invited talk by Vanessa Teague and a keynote by Tanya Lokot. So those should be quite good. And in the middle, of course, we have ice cream. We have been promised that ice cream this year will be a spectacle to behold, so I am counting on some sort of koala appearing ice cream or something of the effect. But we'll have to wait and see what exactly transpires at lunchtime. And for those of you joining us from GatherTown, you are very much encouraged to go to the ice cream section of GatherTown and bring your own ice cream. And last year we had an epic dance party. I think we should try to repeat that. So yes, that's all I wanted to say for these opening remarks. Our first talk is going to be by Elissa Redmiles, and Rebecca, my co-chair, is going to take it over to give the introduction to Elissa.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Good. So hello everyone from a very, very early morning in Europe. I'm going to introduce Elissa, who is a faculty member at the Max Planck Institute. Her work focuses on computational, economic, and social science methods to understand users' security, privacy, and online safety-related decision-making processes. And I'm very excited to hear her talk called Sex Work and Technology, Lessons for Internet Governance and Digital Society. So for that, I'm going to pass over the mic to Elissa.
Thanks for the kind introduction. Let me just share some slides. Wonderful. So as Becca said, I will be talking about sex work and technology and what we can learn, or at least think about in terms of internet governance and privacy, as well as kind of safety more generally from sex workers. And this work is, of course, collaborative with a number of different folks, both from inside of and outside of the sex working community. So sex workers make up a sizable portion of the global workforce. An estimated 1 in every 200 people will have worked in the sex industry in their lifetime. And sex work is both criminalized and stigmatized. So in Australia, sex work is regulated, but in much of the rest of the world, it is criminalized or kind of operates under unusual legal regulations. And as a result, that can create a lot of stigma and marginalization, not just because of the legal landscape, but because of the general kind of social landscape toward talking about sex and sex work in particular. Technology is used in sex work in a variety of ways. So there's online-only sex work, where you have platforms like, say, Chatterbait, where people will do virtual kind of strip shows, or platforms like OnlyFans that have gotten a lot of attention recently, where people will sell digital sexual content. So this can be videos, images, even kind of sexting services where you can talk to the person who creates that content. And then, of course, for in-person sex work, there's also a digital component where people will be doing digital advertising or communicating with their clients or using safety technologies. And we'll talk about that a bit today. So today's focus is on the intersection of sex work and technology, and particularly kind of the role of safety and what safety means in this context. And the reason that I want to talk to the PETs community about sex work and technology is because if we design for people kind of at the margins, we are better able to design for safety for everyone, and also allow ourselves not to exclude those who are already being excluded, even further by the way that we create our technologies. So I'll start today by talking about work with in-person sex workers. That was a 2-year-long research project in 3 countries where sex work is legal and regulated. And then toward the end of the talk, I'll talk about how things changed with the COVID pandemic, and talk a bit about how the risks that folks face changed as they went completely online with the kind of work that they do. So in this first part of the talk, I'll talk about the results of this research project. And in this project, we did both interviews and surveys with sex workers. And when working with this population, because of the sensitive nature of the work, even though we were studying folks who were working in countries where sex work is legal, there's still a lot of stigma, a lot of marginalization, and different kind of layers of migration status and et cetera that can be involved. And so we thought in a lot of detail about the protection mechanisms that we would use in doing this research, right? And so these interviews were conducted with end-to-end encryption, and people could do phone or video interviews as is typical, or chat-based interviews, so that we never saw their face, never heard their voice, none of that was recorded. Part of why the project was a 2-year-long exercise was because recruitment, of course, requires a great deal of kind of trust. The sex working community is very kind of tightly knit and very reasonably not necessarily super open to outsiders coming in, especially as they've been very kind of over-researched and over-regulated. And so a lot of the time was spent building up relationships with the community, building up trust, and doing in-person, recruitment and so forth. We also wanted to ensure that we had a sex working consultant who was an active member of the sex working community, who could ensure that the work that we were doing and the way that we were going about it was kind of comfortable, appropriate, and ethical beyond the kind of traditional ethics board review, because of course folks on the ethics board may not be from that community. So before getting into the safety piece, I want to talk briefly about the ways that in-person sex workers use or desire to use technology. The first is for advertising. The second is for vetting clients, and this is actually a safety behavior where if I'm an in-person worker and I'm going to have a client I've never met before, and I'm going to meet with them potentially in a hotel or in my own home, I want to make sure they are who they say they are, they have harmed other workers in the past, and that if something bad were to happen, there's some record of who I was interacting with, so that there can be justice. Folks also want to use technology to communicate with clients. So of course, you have an in-person interaction, but just like any business, you want to keep up with your clients over time, and build that relationship. Folks also want to be able to accept digital payments, to be able to connect with community, to get support and education, and be able to engage in activism as well. So there's both sort of business purposes and then community building purposes that folks would like to be engaged in. The trouble that we find that people face is that despite the fact that they're doing legal work in regulated work, they're paying taxes on that work, the technologies that they seek to use really encode American views and values and impose those on folks globally. So we heard a lot of reports that, it'd be great to be able to use PayPal, for example, but sex work is forbidden there. And if you go ahead and you use PayPal, you might get blocked. Someone else said, I had many, many followers on Instagram, and at some point I hadn't even posted nudes or anything. At some point it was just deleted. And so that definitely hurt my business. And one participant put this experience very well. And they said, as someone who offers proactive erotic services, you're clearly at a disadvantage in the American dominated internet. There's censorship and restrictions. And a key theme that came up in this work was that the technologies were regulating not just the work, right? They weren't just regulating, hey, you can't send that particular kind of payment, or you can't post that particular kind of content. They were regulating people's identities. So we had workers who said, I have one device for work. I have totally separate pictures, emails, etc. I never show my face, yada, yada, yada. I have a phone for personal, and then I have a third phone, and that phone is just to be able to try to use something like Airbnb. And even with that level of protective mechanism, and I'm not using Airbnb for work, I'm still getting banned from Airbnb. And we're not the first to find this. Vice and Rolling Stone have reported about it, and Airbnb actually has a patent for doing what appears to be potentially facial recognition, also some scraping and some prediction to try to figure out who are the people they don't want on the platform. This includes sex workers, folks who may have mental health issues, etc. There's very little transparency about how it's working. So people's identity is being regulated, not just their work, and it doesn't matter, if they're doing that work legally or not. Similarly, on Instagram, sex workers, including those that are even doing work that's legal in the US, may not be able to create community with each other because any kind of conversation that facilitates, encourages, or coordinates commercial sexual services of any kind is banned on Instagram. And as all of us know, particularly during the pandemic era, but in general, digital community is how a lot of us find our communities. We create connection, especially when they're at the margins. And so taking that away really limits people's safety and just general welfare. And it's not just sort of mainstream technology that's the only kind of technology that's causing harm. So even in the adult industry, people had experienced harms. So one person reported, a online adult platform copied my ads out of newspapers and put them on the internet without asking. And so all of a sudden they were getting phone calls from people who said, oh, I found your ad online. And they were like, what ad online? Similarly, there are other websites that have scraped sex workers' websites and made an ad. And this is both like a violation of privacy, and in some cases, they were posting services that people didn't offer, which can be quite dangerous if someone comes in thinks they're going to get one service and that's not something you offer, and they decide to kind of push it. Additionally, a lot of the technology in the adult industry is not particularly inclusive of the breadth of folks who are in the sex industry. So one participant reported that they're transmasculine, and so most of the clients and the resources are set up for cis women, and so they weren't even able to advertise on many advertising platforms because there just were not features available to describe them. And this creates financial harm, right? Because you cannot advertise yourself online. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how sex workers use or want to use technology, the kind of harms that they can face, and sort of the breadth of those harms, right? Let's talk a little bit more in detail about sex workers' digital safety. Our first research question focuses on how sex workers define safety. What does it mean to be safe as a sex worker? The second is, what are the major barriers to staying safe online? So we already talked about this kind of American-dominated internet and being deplatformed, right? Being kicked off of platforms for your identity or for your work. But what are the other barriers, particularly technical ones? And finally, what are the strategies that these folks are using to stay safe? And as a small aside, people often ask me, how did you end up kind of studying this topic? And the answer is really in kind of the first and the last question that are here. Often in the security and privacy community, I would hear folks say, well, if only people understood the risks, then they would do the behaviors. Then they would, use all of these tools, these pets that we made for them. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, well, I feel like often when I talk to participants, even those who aren't at the margins, they have a pretty good sense of the risks, and they don't want to use these strategies sometimes. But maybe I'm wrong. And maybe it's just that I'm not talking to people who have salient enough risks. And that was really how I ended up coming to work with this community, was to say, well, this is a community with really, really stark risks. They get no specialized training for safety, unlike, say, journalists who might. And what are these folks' experiences? What strategies are they using? And what can we learn from what they're doing, and how can we make it better? Okay, so let's start out with, what does it mean to be safe? In this work, what we found is that there are 7 forms of boundaries: being treated with respect, having access to community, having legal protections, and having access to privacy. And I'll give examples of a few of these. First is physical safety. So one participant said, this means being able to work without fear of abuse or aggression. Physical safety can intersect with other forms of safety, and all of these forms of safety can intersect with each other. So one participant said, when speaking about physical safety and privacy is when clients don't know my name or address. An unannounced visit from a friend would be nice. An unannounced visit from a client would be a catastrophe. When we think about financial security, right, in security and privacy, we often think about scams, but even having access to money is a form of safety. So one person said, if I had financial pressure to accept jobs against my better judgment, or there was someone demanding services I don't offer, I would be unsafe. And we'll talk about a bit later, if you don't have access to any kind of digital payments, right, this also forces you to use cash and carry cash in large quantities. That makes you both at risk of assault, robbery, and raises a lot of questions when you go to pay your rent. So there's a lot of forms of financial security that can intersect with digital safety. Finally, for respect, one participant said, being safe means not feeling that society thinks it's normal for me to get hurt. And as we'll see, a lot of the ways that digital platforms can operate kind of embeds this concept that we do think it's normal for folks to get hurt, whether it's digital or physical. Okay, So we know how sex workers are defining safety. What are the barriers to achieving that safety? One barrier is that clients can be aggressive or invasive, right? So one person described an experience of being blackmailed, and others, other clients showing up at their place of work looking for them. And the participant said, well, it's unsettling, but with the right precautions, I've learned to avoid it. I'd much rather lose money than meet someone with the potential to cause problems. And, one participant had sort of a digital security experience of this, and many participants had this, but I'll describe this person's story. They said, well, my partner is a photographer and photographed me a couple of times. I wasn't very smart, and I published my photos with his tag on a relatively public forum. Then a client of mine who is also very fond of me, which I didn't realize, did some research and figured out who my boyfriend is. He found our places of business and then, of course, knew what we do in our free time, what our names are. Since then, I pay very close attention to what tag is on the pictures. So clients can be very motivated to find workers. As we already talked about, sex work advertising websites can be predatory and can create boundary violations as well as privacy violations. And even the laws that regulate sex work can create exposure risks. For example, in Germany, there's a requirement that websites have what's called an impressum. So you must disclose the name, address, and contact information of the person who owns the website somewhere on the site. And this has to be the legal information of this entity. And so sex workers with personal websites have to either disclose this information or risk violating the law. And so sex working collectives or unions in Germany have actually bonded together to create legal entities that they can put on their websites instead of their own personal information. Also, as I mentioned, right, online platforms discriminate against sex workers, and this can create numerous interpersonal risks. And as we discussed a bit, these risks are intersectional, right? So lack of access, as I said, to digital payments can reduce physical safety and threaten financial security. And this is one of the reasons that greater access to the internet can actually improve physical safety. And we'll talk about that a bit more later. Additionally, right, banning communities from discussing sex work online means that people don't have access to harm reduction information, whether that's about kind of public health issues or how to deal with a client who's become violent or dangerous, or just how to effectively market yourself and earn money to get out of, say, homelessness. Finally, theft of IP, scraping of this content, which is done not just by adult platforms, but also by, say, anti-trafficking organizations that want to reach out to people, depending on how they use that information, could lead to someone who has access to a worker's phone finding out that they're a sex worker when they didn't know that. Or, as I said, to having clients show up who think they're going to be able to get a particular service and they can't, and they force the issue. So these kinds of, privacy violations, digital thefts of content can lead to very real physical harm. Okay, so what are the strategies that sex workers use to stay safe? What we find is a lot of kind of vetting and in-person safety practices. So covering is a technique where you will tell a friend or a colleague, details about your appointment. This is who I'm going to see. This is when I'm going to see them. This is how long the appointment should be. I'll text you after the appointment. If I don't text you, here's what you should do. This is a technique that folks who are doing online dating or other forms of gig work also do, but not to nearly the level of prevalence that we see in our sex working participants. You also have vetting, which I described earlier, and that is also extremely prevalent among sex working participants as well, and is done by some other groups like daters. So often security and privacy folks will ask me, okay, what about things like security and privacy settings? Not so many people were using them. And the reason for that was, as someone said, I don't think it matters if you put settings on or off. When I have to talk about something, I mind there isn't a phone in the room. And we had numerous participants who said, well, I did have privacy settings. And then, it suggested a friend on Facebook or Twitter who is a client, or it had a bug and then it didn't work. These are folks in situations where a software bug can lead to very big physical safety issues. They're not really willing to risk it on, oh, let me try a setting. And similarly, folks are not necessarily using security tools, but the reason for this is a bit different. As one participant put it, I would gladly do all of the above, use encrypted chat, use VPN, use encrypted email, etc. That only really works when the customers participate. And we heard from numerous workers, well, it has to be cooperative with clients, right? I can no more force Max Planck to pay me in cryptocurrency than a sex worker can force their client to pay in cryptocurrency or converse with them over encrypted email. Some folks who are at the most privileged kind of levels of the work are able to do so, just like in any other industry, but most cannot. And so this raises questions about kind of usability, what might make it easier for folks to have clients use these tools, or do we just need more widespread awareness and adoption such that that's normal? We can kind of discuss some of those options in a bit, but we see relatively low adoption, not because of awareness, but because of that need for cooperation. Instead, what we see a lot of folks doing is identity management, and they're doing it manually. So folks are trying very hard to separate their work and personal personas. And a lot of them are using an alias, and a great number of them are using completely separate devices. But as one participant said, it's time consuming and it's annoying. It's stressful having all of these phones and personas and things I have to remember. And I'm like, shit, did I mess that up when I put this up all the time? And people talk about, this kind of resignation, right? I went in, I checked my work email one time on this device. And now, I know that they're probably forever linked because of that one mistake. And folks work in this industry for 10, 20 years, right? That's a long time to be doing this kind of manual separation. Related to this manual separation, right, people are also doing quite a lot of self-censorship. So very carefully curating kind of a persona for the work that is completely different from their personal persona. Can include covering up tattoos. It can include changing hair color. It can be very, very deep in terms of changing this persona. And, some folks who work in person never show their face in an ad ever, or any kind of identifying feature, a mole, a tattoo, whatever it is. We'll talk about in a bit, that gets a little harder when you're working only online to be able to do that kind of thing. People also kind of delete their content or destroy devices. One person said, I'm legally allowed to work, but I'm scared of getting banned from certain countries just for being a sex worker. So I remove all of my information, everything, and wipe my phone before I go traveling. As I mentioned, right, there is this kind of resignation and regret, and a very clear understanding of, the issues that could happen when mistakes are made. As one participant said, this stuff could get me killed or deported. I'm not prepared. Okay, so we've talked about kind of this was the world of in-person sex work, digital safety experiences prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. What happened when the pandemic hit? Well, people couldn't do in-person sex work for two reasons. The first is, even in countries where sex work is regulated or legal, lockdown laws and regulations meant that doing work in person was no longer legal. It eventually would return, but it was not legal at the time. And of course, COVID was a risk for both sex workers and their clients. As one participant said, I'm immunocompromised, so is my housemate. Neither of us are vaccinated because at that time there weren't vaccines available. So it's too much of a risk to do in-person work. And so folks shifted to online sex work kind of en masse. And of course, it wasn't just in-person sex workers who made this shift. It was also folks who hadn't been working in the sex industry. And so there was a lot of competition. All of a sudden, the online market got very saturated. And what people found was that shifting to online sex work from in-person work required a much larger online footprint. So clients were expecting a much richer digital persona for online sex work. So that meant being on more platforms so you could get yourself more visible, you could appeal to clients who liked different platforms. It meant being more explicit because folks were kind of expecting the explicitness of in-person services to move online. And also the online industry with porn, with camming, has a tradition of being more explicit in the digital content. And you had to have more information out there, right? They wanted to see you at the cafe or know what movies you were watching or really have this like parasocial relationship with the person who is doing digital sex work. And while that can be true with in-person work, it was definitely not a requirement. And many folks felt, as they moved online, that in order to make any money or compete, they now needed to kind of be online in more places and give more of themselves online, whether that was more explicit images, more information about their interests, etc. They had to build out a richer persona. And one person said, well, the worst thing that I think about is that you have to have in mind that those videos will be leaked and all the people around you are going to get them at some point and they will be forever on the internet. In face-to-face sex work, I didn't have my intimacy compromised. If I had troubles, they were going to stay there. With online work, people will have photos and videos of everything, and I won't ever be able to delete that. They will stay floating around forever. Also, if I stop doing sex work, that may affect me in the future too. So in addition to the risks we already talked about and in magnification of some of them, we already know that there's this, discrimination from online platforms. Now you're on even more online platforms. So you have even more kind of opportunity for deplatforming. You have changing rules about what can be posted, etc. It magnifies the relevance of this in your life because you're even more online. There is also more risk of stalking and doxing because you're putting out more information online. So one participant said, well, I took a selfie in a bathroom and I uploaded it to Twitter. And a guy went to the same bathroom and posted a selfie of him in that bathroom in reply to mine, like trying to tell me, I know where you are. Those stalker things are the ones that make me more scared. You also have kind of concerns around the privacy of explicit personal content. Most of the folks who were doing in-person sex work previously were not, posting explicit content of themselves online. That was not kind of part of their marketing strategy. And their main concern when it came to explicit content was that someone might secretly record a session. But as some folks described, you could kind of go in and out of sex work. You could, if you needed to, you could go do some work, reset up your ads, and then go away. And most of the time, you had to be concerned about outing, being found out, but mostly you could kind of do this a little bit anonymously if you wanted to. Digital sex work sort of took that feeling away. And so one participant said, obviously there's always that concern that some of my content is going to pop up on Pornhub. That's always a risk and part of the reason I prefer in-person sex work to online, but it's a risk you live with. So how did this change people's safety strategies? So as folks were doing digital sex work, they started, as I said, right, the deplatforming was an even bigger problem. And so folks started finding tools for censorship evasion. So one participant said, well, there's this website where you put a photo, like a photo that you want to upload to Instagram. And the website claims that it uses the same machine learning that Instagram uses. And the website will tell you if this picture you want to upload is too sexy, and whether you can upload it to Instagram or not. So people are using these kind of AI tools to predict ahead of time whether content would be censored. And the reason they want to do this is that platforms have like a hierarchy of banning you, right? So the first time you do a violation, maybe they ban you for 24 hours. The next time you do a violation, it might be 3 days. The next time, 7 days. Next time, a month. This can really take a bite out of your business. You lose clients, etc. Because people were hyper aware of the chance of being deplatformed, they also did their own client management. So if they had a bunch of followers on Instagram or Twitter, they were collecting those folks' email or other contact or making a Discord so that they could ensure that if or when, as some people described it, they lost that account, they still were able to have access to their clients. We also see censorship strategies, right? Like nesting of links. So TikTok wouldn't allow you to say go directly, link directly to your OnlyFans, which is known for being a big sex work platform. And so instead you're going to use a link tree that links to OnlyFans. Well, this wasn't true when we did this research, but now TikTok will even screen out the thing in the link tree. So you have to go 3 layers down. There's always kind of this cat and mouse game around the censorship. People are also doing much more advanced strategies around IP and content protection. And people sometimes ask me like, well, we have solutions for digital rights management. Kind of how is this different? And I'd say it's different in 2 ways. So the first is, of course, resourcing. So, you know, the Blockbuster and Warner Brothers and so forth, they have a lot more resources to do this kind of work, both in terms of protecting it, tracking it, requesting takedown. They have a lot more authority in getting people to take them seriously. And there's no issue of provenance. No one's going to kind of question if Warner Brothers owns, you know, this particular movie. When it comes to content of yourself, sexual content of yourself, then there's a question, you know, is it really you who's requesting takedown or is it someone else? And it kind of can get very complicated and platforms don't always want to deal with that. So what are folks doing? They're doing watermarking. So they might put the name of a client on a picture. They might say the client's name, often in a video, in hopes that this will prevent them from wanting to spread it. They will go and use particular adult platforms that do a good job of tracking the content that's uploaded on them and that automatically send what are called DMCA takedown notices, which is a regulation in the US in particular that offers copyright protection. And so one person said, well, I use this particular platform because of the fact that they do these takedown notices. Other people would set up Google alerts for their name and just kind of constantly track whether their content was being uploaded. You know, people also had stalking prevention strategies. So there are still people who tried having like no face or adding or removing tattoos. No face got very challenging just because of the kind of competition in the market. People also had a lot of strategies around uploading photos. So people would try not to take photos in easy to identify locations. So some person said, you know, I have worries because my room has an unusual shape. And for a while, I was worried that if someone went through a real estate listing and found that my room looks like that, that's a concern of mine. People talked about not filming in anywhere where you could tell what time of day it was for them, posting content out of order or once you've already left a location so you don't have like that concerning incident with the bathroom, etc. And these aren't kind of just fears that people have, right? These were sometimes realized where someone did look up information on a real estate website and etc. All right, so we know kind of what does it mean to be safe? What are the threats? How do they change when everything is online versus when it's offline? What can be built, right? Well, these are the 4 kind of, you know, 3 top types of tools and the 1 tenet for how we should be building them. So we need tools that accommodate multiple personas. This is something that's been raised in the literature, but not necessarily something I'd say that we've made amazing progress on, particularly at a very deep level, right? These are folks who need hardware level separated personas, but wouldn't it be nice not to have, as one participant put it, so many phones? How can we accommodate really deep delinking of personas in a way that's usable? And this would be helpful not just for sex workers, but for folks who are transitioning gender identities, for folks who are, you have multiple people using a single device, but you don't want this kind of interplay, for folks who are undergoing situations of domestic violence. There are a lot of folks who need a single device that can be multiple completely separate non-linkable personas. That's a big need. A second big need is algorithmic transparency, not just privacy transparency. And that's not to say that privacy transparency isn't very important. It is. Algorithmic transparency is important too, right? So we have folks who are using these kinds of mysterious predictive tools to try to see if content will be banned. Ideally, platforms should be offering that, right? Like Instagram doesn't want the content that's too sexy. Sex workers don't want to get banned from Instagram. Why don't we have pre-screening tools? Maybe it's unlikely that platforms will make those. Certainly something that we can try to create as a community. Tools that better support this tracking and protection of content, and particularly kind of identification of content. Being able to, have a chain of trust to say, I'm really the one who took the picture, I'm really the person who's in the picture, and I really want it taken down from this website because this is not where I posted it and consented to it. We also see, not on the slide, but we also see options for kind of better privacy technologies as well. So we had folks who were going to the level of depth, and this was among not folks who had done in-person sex work in the past, but among folks who had never done sex work, but started doing online sex work in the pandemic. One of the things we saw those folks doing was if they wanted to keep people from finding out they were doing sex work, they would create a new Instagram or Twitter or whatever for their sex work persona. They would go to their personal Instagram and they would, go through the list of people they followed and the list of people all of those people followed, and they would manually block all of those people on the new sex work persona. And in some cases, this was like 1,000 people that they went and manually blocked. These are the kind of tools perhaps we can build. At least we can measure how far down the tree do you need to go, where is there more or less privacy gain, etc. But with all of these tools, the key is to have their construction led by or in collaboration with the populations they serve, right? So it's very important that the communities are kind of driving the technology because they understand their use case best, they understand their risks best, and there's kind of no use in taking what's already a marginalizing situation and making it more disempowering or more paternalistic. And that doesn't mean kind of offloading the labor, right? It means partnering so that the labor that we do to build things is useful, empowering, not extractive, not exploitive, not making things worse. And so we want to empower communities to be able to design and build and evaluate the technology that serves them. And as one participant said, honestly, I would say one of my biggest pet peeves is that almost all of the platforms that sex workers use as far as advertising and keeping ourselves safe, none of them are run by sex workers or even in collaboration with sex workers. Many of them are run by older white dudes who are profiting off of the workers. And I find that problematic in many ways. So to summarize, kind of key next steps in this area are to regulate against kind of globalized tech censorship of work and identity. And that's affected not just sex workers, but trans folks, drag queens, different minority populations in the US. We shouldn't have technologies that are regulating what identities are and are not allowed to exist. We want to be sure to incorporate and listen to marginalized voices in this kind of policy development and in developing technologies. And I'll add sort of a fourth ad lib point, which is we want to start thinking about, at least I want to advocate for starting to think about safety in this kind of broad way, right? That it isn't just privacy, it isn't just security, it's also things like being able to set boundaries, which really relates a lot to privacy, but can even be, broader than that in the kinds of boundaries we want to be able to set, in having respect, in having physical safety, financial security. This is all very intersectional and to me forms what is safety, and security and privacy digitally really underpin that. But we can think a little bit broader about the kinds of things we can create to facilitate safety that go outside maybe some of the things we traditionally think of. And I'll close with a participant quote, which is that I want technology that considers me a person and not a product, but that's really asking for a lot from the anonymous virtual world. Thank you, and happy to take questions or discuss now.